Jason, it's good to see you again. How are you?
I'm doing much better, thank you. Since our last meeting, I think I've made good progress in understanding why we all sometimes resist good changes, or make changes that end up being bad for us.
Tell me about the progress with your coworkers.
As you recommended, I shared Dr. Ellie Goldrat's change matrix to help us better understand the conflict we're facing. I explained that making any change in your life, or in any organization, is like climbing a mountain. There are two good reasons for us to climb the mountain. There is a pot of gold at the top which represents the future upside of the proposed change. And there is also a nasty alligator at the base of the mountain that represents the current downside of not changing. But there are also two reasons for not wanting to climb the mountain. There is the future downside of the change, like the effort or cost of climbing, and the risk of falling, which is represented by two crutches. The current upside of not changing is not having to leave behind the beautiful mermaid. We can't take her with us up the mountain, so she represents what we fear giving up if we change.
So what insights did you gain when you shared all your upside and downside assumptions with your coworkers?
We realized that the main reason we tend to resist changes that would be good for us is because of the exaggerated fears of loss and risk, and that as the initiator of this change, I have a responsibility to understand and help address these fears.
And what about our tendency to sometimes overreact and make changes that would likely be bad for us?
We realize that when we sometimes overreact and make changes that end up being bad for us, it's likely due to exaggerated frustrations or exaggerated expectations.
Those are really good insights. Unfortunately, our confirmation bias can cause us to only look for evidence to validate rather than challenge these fears and frustrations, which can cause us to get stuck.
Prof, that's exactly where we are. We're kind of stuck now.
Well, for these more complicated cases, I've been testing a new method called the Change Matrix Cloud.
So how does the CMC method work?
Well, it consists of 5 steps. Each step is designed to prevent one of the 5 most common decision mistakes that we make. In step 1, you define the problem and its impact. This is to avoid focusing on unimportant problems or not focusing on important problems. Step 2 is to define the change conflicts. This prevents you from jumping to a solution or blaming people. Step 3 is to resolve the change conflict. The mistake here is focusing only on one resolution and not realizing that there are 4 alternatives. Step 4 is overcoming yes buts. We don't want to ignore valid reservations, or let these reservations be an excuse not to act. Then in step 5, we design an experiment to implement the new change. This helps ensure that we learn from our mistakes and actually solve the problem we started with. The good news is that you've already completed 2 steps when you filled in the change matrices for you and your coworkers' conflicts.
That's good news. So where do we start?
Well, first, let's review the 2 steps of your story that you've already completed so far. In step 1, you define the problem you are facing as the disharmony with your coworkers. In step 2, the consequence and cause of this problem, you wanting to quit your job, and you blaming your coworkers' resistance to change for the disharmony. Then you completed the 2 change matrices, yours and those you blame for your problem.
Okay, so how is the change matrix cloud different?
It just rearranges these elements so that the upsides are above and downsides below the conflict you and they face. Then we add each side's desired goal on top of the upsides and the possible threat from the downsides at the bottom. These help us check if the upsides and downsides we listed are really important to us and them, and whether we could have exaggerated any of them.
I'm not sure I understand. Can we fill it in with the details of my story so I can see how it works?
Sure. See, most of it's done already. The only parts you need to add are the goal and the threat. So, looking at the upsides of your conflict about taking the new job or not, what's the overall goal you want to achieve?
I want to be happy at work again, and feel like I'm actually contributing to the success of the organization.
And what would be the major threat to that goal?
Probably if my poor productivity, or the disharmony with my coworkers, hurts the organization's performance.
Very good, Jason. Now do the same for the coworkers' conflict. You see, you've just completed the first 2 steps of the Change Matrix Cloud process. Quite simple, right?
Yes, simple, but definitely not easy. And why is it called a cloud?
Well, because these conflicts hang over us like dark clouds. In order to evaporate these clouds, we have to challenge one of 2 key assumptions. The first way is realizing that either our fears or frustrations are probably exaggerated. Secondly, that even though our fears and frustrations are real, not exaggerated, they can be overcome in a way that will have more upside and less downside than the current status quo.
And how do you find such viable alternatives to resolve our conflict and the conflict of those we blame for our problem?
In step 3, conflict resolution, the CMC method guides us through 4 possible ways to resolve any conflict.
4? I thought there was only one way. Reaching a compromise.
No, compromises require that both sides give up something. We want both sides to gain something, to find a way to get more upside and or less downside than before. And there are only 4 possible ways to achieve this. The 4 conflict resolutions are called change plus plus, not change plus plus, when and when not to change, and another change. The pluses in methods 1 and 2 are simply the solution elements we have to add to ensure we get more of the upsides we want to gain and keep, and less of the downsides we don't want to gain or keep.
Okay, that makes sense. So these 4 different methods will then give us 4 possible win-win ways to resolve any conflict.
Right, and you'll simply select the one with the most upsides and least downsides for all stakeholders.
Is there a guideline for how to apply each method?
Yes, for each method we will ask 3 questions. What is the assumption or condition that blocks us from resolving the conflict with that method? Then we ask, what if the opposite was true? We simply state the opposite to see if this will resolve the conflict. We call this an injection. Lastly, we ask, how can we achieve this?
But Prof, how does it help to simply state the injection as the opposite of the assumption as if it's true?
That's exactly what's required to challenge an assumption. You see, turning your assumptions around is a simple and powerful way to challenge them. Let's start with method 1, change plus plus. The first why assumption is exposed by answering, why will the change you want result in losing the mermaid? In this case, the coworkers stopping multitasking.
They probably assume that single tasking will result in them no longer being able to look and feel busy.
Good. And now state the opposite of it as if it was true to get your first plus, and then see if you can come up with a practical how-to to achieve this.
Single tasking will result in them looking and feeling even more busy. And how can they achieve this? Well, I suppose we can implement a new productivity measurement, which will show that single tasking actually increases our task completion rate.
Good job. Now let's talk about how to minimize the risk of the crutches by answering the second why. Changing will have the risk of the crutches when or if.
Okay. Changing will have the risk of the crutches because it's hard to break a multitasking habit, or if our boss doesn't like it when we say, not now.
Now turn these assumptions around with an injection.
Let's see. Changing will not risk the crutches because it is easy to break a habit, and the boss will be accepting of cases when we have to say, not now.
Now how will you make these injections come true?
Well, by appointing task managers, we can ensure that our people only have one task at a time. We should also have rules in place which guide when we start new tasks. It seems we've evaporated our cloud, right?
Slow down, Jason. You still have 3 more potential solutions to investigate. How about not change plus plus?
Okay. Not changing means that I have to give up the pot of gold as long as we can't improve productivity and reduce stress by continuing to multitask.
So the turnaround injection is easy. There is a way to improve productivity by multitasking.
Right, but the tough question is how to achieve this. We know that we can't really do 2 or more tasks at the same time. We're actually just task switching. So the how-to can be that we implement a rule that we switch tasks only when we can't make progress on the task we're busy with. That should work, right?
Nice thinking. Now how about getting rid of the alligators?
Okay. Not changing will result in the alligator when or if, by continuing to multitask delay days and working late will also continue. And to turn that around, not changing avoids the alligator when or if multitasking stops delay days and working late.
How will you do that?
I think that allowing people to switch tasks when they can no longer make progress will actually help reduce delay days and overtime.
That sounds like a good rule. Now let's look at the conditional option, the when and when not. Under what conditions is the proposed change to not multitask in conflict with the status quo?
I suppose that there is only a conflict if people have more than one task to work on without clear priorities, or if they're misunderstanding what multitasking actually is.
So what is your injection, and how will this be implemented?
I think the injection is to define multitasking as switching from a high to a low priority task, when we could have continued to make progress on the high priority task. So, our new rule should simply be, when you can still make progress and you are still working on the highest priority task, then don't switch. Otherwise, you should switch to the next highest priority task.
I really like that definition. Now for the final option. What is your another change? Something that is completely unrelated to whether or not to multitask, but could help someone get most of the upside and none of the downside.
You know, I think we can be more productive if we can automate or delegate some of the work. That could free up our most valuable resource, our attention.
Wow, nice one. So now we've got 4 possible solutions. Which one of these do you think will give the most upside with the least downside?
I think all of them can work, but the Change++ option is probably the way to go. But it's not going to be easy to get buy-in from all the stakeholders.
Aha! You've just stumbled onto the next step. The 4th step of the Change Matrix Cloud is to find all of the yes buts.
What are yes buts?
Yes buts are the stakeholder reservations that will need to be addressed or overcome in order to ensure that our new injection is acceptable and that it actually achieves the desired outcomes. There are 3 main types of yes buts. The first is that the new injection might not be sufficient. The second is that implementing the new injection will have possible negative consequences. And the third type of yes but is that there may be some implementation obstacle that you have to overcome.
So, what do we do about such yes buts?
Firstly, we encourage the stakeholders to identify as many of them as possible to help us improve our injections. Then we ask the one who raised it what they propose should be added or changed to the injection to address these. For example, in your Change++ option, your project managers might raise the insufficiency yes but that as long as top management keeps releasing more projects, the pressure to multitask will continue. Perhaps the solution would be to engage with the top management to control the release of projects. Now your turn. Put yourself in the other stakeholder's shoes. What potential negative consequence yes buts would they likely raise about your Change++ injection?
I was talking to one of our IT managers. He said that by not starting projects as soon as possible, it could create the impression with customers that we don't value them, or that we don't have enough capacity. We might lose their business.
That's true.
So we would have to reach out to these customers and explain to them that even though we're starting their projects later, we're going to finish them earlier.
That sounds good. Now how about any implementation obstacle?
Our HR department often says that extra training means time away from working on projects. That leads to overtime and higher costs. We can reduce the training time by having templates readily available. We can create a YouTube explanation video on how the CMC can be used to solve real-life problems, at work and at home.
That sounds good. Now we've come to the 5th step, design and experiment. This step answers the what, how, and the 3 whys of any new better practice that you developed with the CMC method.
This is great. It feels like we've evaporated at least one of the dark clouds that were hanging over me. And I'm confident if more appear, I could evaporate them too.
That's great, Jason, but let me emphasize that the 5th step is arguably the most important. Make sure you summarize and communicate your full analysis, new solution, and measurements of success with all of the necessary stakeholders. Also, put everything you've learned into action, because if you make a decision but you don't follow through with action, you're just going to end up with another failure.
So true. Thanks, Professor. I couldn't have done it without you.
Sure thing, Jason. It's been great working with you.
Take care. If you have a conflict about how best to deal with a problem you're facing, or want to understand why those you blame did what they did, why not try out the Change Matrix Cloud method on your own case to tell your story? Simply follow the link below to download a Google Doc with the templates of the 5 steps and get started right away.